Good morning. Welcome to Patrick Henry College and our conference titled Idols, Identity Politics, and the Lies of Our Age. This event is co-sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and the American Conservative, and we're grateful to partner with them today. Today we'll be exploring some important cultural, political, and even spiritual trends that are in so many ways convulsing our nation, and in fact much of the world. And in order to better grasp how to respond, we must first clearly grasp what exactly is going on. And our speakers today have been thinking about these matters for many years, and we're excited to have them join us today. And our day will consist of 2 talks this morning, then a break for lunch, a third talk at 1 o'clock, and then all 3 of our speakers will come together for a panel discussion to finish the day. And throughout this day, you'll have opportunities to engage our speakers. Those of you attending in person can do so with a microphone and during Q&A times at the end of each talk. Those of you who are joining us on Zoom, welcome. And you will be able to ask questions using Zoom technology. You know this better than I do. There's some place on that screen where you can type in your questions, and we have somebody who will be looking at those questions and sifting through those and putting those to our speakers as well. So do feel free to engage using Zoom. And when you do that, include your first name and, if appropriate, your academic affiliation. That way we can kind of get a sense of where you're coming from. Our first speaker today is Daniel J. Mahoney. Professor Mahoney holds the Augustine Chair of Distinguished Scholarship at Assumption University. He's a specialist on totalitarianism and anti-totalitarian thought, and has spoken at over 100 colleges and universities, and participated in well over 200 academic or intellectual forums and conferences. I've gotten to know Professor Mahoney over the past year or so, and I found him to be both generous and wise, and a fearless and clear-sighted defender of the permanent things. Professor Mahoney has written or edited 14 books, including most recently, The Idol of Our Age: How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. His talk today is titled The Ersatz Religion of Our Time: How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity and Free and Decent Politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Mahoney.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mitchell. Real pleasure to be here at Patrick Henry College. I think in all my years of giving talks, I've never given a talk in an auditorium or gym, so this is a welcome first. Today I'm going to speak on some of the themes that animated my most recent book, The Idol of Our Age. Ersatz, by the way, means substitute, a substitute religion for our time. And the argument of The Idol of Our Age, which came out in December of 2018 from Encounter Books and was released in paperback in April of 2020, and it was widely reviewed and discussed, mainly but not exclusively in conservative and Christian circles, but also reviewed more widely. But the main theme of the book is that over a long period of time, but with ever-growing intensity, there has been a great and terrible conflation of the Christian religion with secular humanitarianism, or what I also call, following the 19th century French social theorist Auguste Comte, the religion of humanity. If I had a longer talk, I would tell you more about Comte, who was an extremely influential thinker. It's easy to caricature him since he named himself the high priest of the religion of humanity, even had himself crowned the high priest of the religion of humanity at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1851, and invited the Pope the head of the Jesuit order and the Tsar to his coronation. But if you know anything about the history of modern Brazil, you'll know that the founders of the modern Brazilian Republic were Comteans. They were anti-clerical, anti-Christian positivists who wanted the religion of humanity to be the animating public philosophy of the new Brazilian Republic. And every time Brazil's in the World Cup or they win a soccer match, you see that flag. It's order and progress. That's the motto of the international Comtean movement, the religion of humanity. Well, that's a sideshow. But it seems to me that Comte's idea that the central or paramount theme of humanity ought to be ourselves. Comte said, man is the grand être, the great being, the supreme being. And to use a term from Machiavelli, I think you could argue that that is, for all intents and purposes, the effectual truth of the late modern world. And alas, many religious believers have come to confuse Comtean altruism, he invented the word, with Christian charity, who are more and more dedicated to a humanitarianism that aims at a kind of comprehensive transformation of the world. Really, I think behind a lot of social justice ideology is this idea that Christianity is basically a project for making the world a more equal, more compassionate, more socially just place. It's always an interesting question, by the way. I ask my students, what is added by putting social in front of justice? And I think a lot of things are added. They're not always so good. But whether we like it or not, the churches today are very much committed to this ideological abstraction called social justice. So one of the things I try to do in The Idol of Our Age is to explain the reality of this ersatz secular religion and to really give it a name, because my experience has been that many serious Christians and Jews have a sense that there's some kind of troubling substitute for transcendental religion that has displaced or corrupted or even transformed a biblical religion, but they don't know, they don't know the genealogy, the origins, the foundations, and they don't know they don't have a sufficient sense of how self-conscious, in other words, how deliberate this substitute for true religion is. So I argue very pungently that this ersatz religion, the religion of humanity, is a mix of several things. Doctrinaire egalitarianism. This is what the great Alexis de Tocqueville called the passion for equality, as opposed to the truth, we might say, of common humanity, of the liberty and dignity of human beings under God. But this passion to equalize. We now have a new woke ideology that tells us that the mere existence of disparities is a form of discrimination. That's the official doctrine of the execrable Ibram Kendi. But, Jews are 22% of professional students in America. They're 2% of the population. Is their academic success a product of racism and exploitation? Or the same with Asian Americans? I think not. But this doctrine would really commit us to the sort of comprehensive leveling of humanity under the guise that any differences, and by the way, spontaneity is built into human nature, but sort of quashing difference in the name of equality is the very definition of doctrinaire egalitarianism. of egalitarianism that is committed to the comprehensive leveling of human beings in society. I think the religion of humanity is also committed to aggressive secularism. Notice my adjectives. Secularism in and of itself. Certainly the recognition that the things of God and the things of Caesar belong to different but overlapping spheres is perfectly compatible with Orthodox Christianity and with sane politics. But an aggressive secularism that aims to drive religion not only out of the public square, but really as being anything. Václav Havel used to say, you know, we now treat religion as values, you know, that sort of go on in the equivalent of the public and private bathroom, you know, so private that they have no real presence in our lives. So the aggressive secularism is really committed to making religion obsolete, and yet at the same time, it upholds, it ratifies, it pushes a substitute religion, you might say, that has all the impetus of the worst of religious fanaticism. And religious fanaticism is a real social and historical and political phenomenon. You know, much like communism and some other ideological doctrines of the 20th century had the intensity of secular religion with none of the dignity and grandeur and truth of revealed or transcendental religion. And just to close out this introduction, it seems to me that, by the way, no editor would like my title because it's really long. You couldn't have that, you know, on a book cover. But I wanted to get in the free and decent politics because it seems to me that the religion of humanity not only subverts authentic religion, but it also undermines moderation and sober political thinking. In other words, I think utopianism and a call for coercive utopian social engineering is at the heart of the religion of humanity. And by the way, Comte, for example, thought that he not only wanted to de-Christianize the advanced or Western world and replace it with this positivistic religion of humanity. Comte is very interesting because he combined positivism in the Cours de Philosophie Positive. He says only how questions matter, why questions, the kinds of questions I think you still study at a place like Patrick Henry College. Why are we here? You know, the fundamental questions of meaning and purpose, the question of the destiny of human beings, the question of the nature of the created whole, the relationship between God and human beings. All of those are non-questions. You know, because they're why questions, and why questions are not in accord with science. So Comte combined that kind of positivism with sentimentality, and his political doctrine was marked by what I would call humanitarian sentimentality. And that humanitarian sentimentality would replace, in Comte's desired utopia, the biblical love of God and man. Comte also thought that wars would be over. In the rational society of the future, war would be an utter and total anachronism. In fact, he declared in 1841 that we would never again see a major war. Well, he was wrong about that. But one great thing about being an ideologist is It's like being some kind of apocalyptic preacher. You know, the world's going to end on June 7th, 1843. Well, it doesn't end, but, you know, the church, that particular sect continues to, you know, postpone the parousia. Well, so Comteanism, like Marxism, posited an end to history through human effort. No grace, no transcendence, no charity, no why questions. And Comte famously said we need to displace politics with the governance of experts, scientific and economic and technocratic experts who would be guided not only by positive science, but by the sentimentality of the religion of humanity. By the way, just a little footnote excursus. Read Flannery O'Connor's great text, The Introduction to the Letter to Marianne. Marianne was a young woman who, in the care of Dominican sisters, who died at the age of 13. She was terribly deformed. And her fellow students and the nuns who had charge of her at the school put together a series of memoirs when she died. And Flannery O'Connor, the great Southern Catholic novelist, used this as an opportunity to reflect on the meaning of suffering in the order of grace, but also how a certain kind of tenderness and sentimentality wants to create a world without Mariannes, like Iceland, where there are no people with Down syndrome because they're all aborted ahead of time. We're all becoming Iceland, hopefully less cold. But yeah, I mean, in a very haunting and striking expression, Flannery O'Connor wrote that tenderness leads to the gas chambers. She saw the totalitarian, the coercive, the inhuman, the unchristian implications of the hardness and cruelty implicit in replacing Christian charity with secular sentimentality. So one of the things I argue in the book is that Comte and Marx, who also believed in a version of the religion of humanity, both are atheists, both are emphatically materialist, but both sort of they have this sort of secular materialist spirituality. But I think they would be startled by the extent to which contemporary Christian self-understanding has come to confuse itself with humanitarianism in one form or another, on the moral plane, on the theological plane, and on the political plane. So what do I have in mind? It seems to me that moral and personal self-limitation has given way to the pursuit of a liberationist and emancipatory cultural project. The revolutionaries in May '68 in France, their motto was "C'est interdit d'interdire." It is forbidden to forbid. To love your neighbor is to accommodate every choice, every lifestyle, no matter how antinomian, morally lawless, subversive of community, that there are no limits, that human beings are autonomous collectively and individually and can shape their future in perfect freedom, unguided. My friend Pierre Menant likes to say, this is liberty without law. Not only the law of custom or the law of a law-driven free society, but it's a society without the Decalogue or without the moral law, as Kant put it. I also think that many progressive Christians have succumbed to a kind of dreamy, utopian cosmopolitanism. They reject the nation as the political form that gives, I'm not talking about nationalism, which can be a pathology, but the nation has been the home of self-government, and it's been the great political vehicle for sustaining our civic and moral and religious heritage. Notice how many people in all the churches, the progressive Protestants, the liberal Protestants, the present progressive Pope, Bergoglio from Argentina, half-baked bishops everywhere and clerics, left-wing evangelicals, they all believe in something like the world governing authority. You know, nations and borders are illicit and need to be overcome, and humanity, in other words, that the religion of humanity needs a global political expression. And before I talked about the cult of social justice, it seems to me that social justice in this sort of confused mix of humanitarianism and progressive Christianity, it reduces love to a strictly horizontal dimension. In other words, it no longer has the demands or makes the demands of caritas on our souls. It no longer depends on the transforming grace of God, but instead is simply an instrument of sentimentality and tenderness that often takes, paradoxically, a hard, coercive form, a la Flannery O'Connor. But a sure mark that religion has degenerated into the religion of humanity is when love is understood in a relativistic way, tolerating everything, and in an inclusive way to say that only universal humanity embodies Christian virtues and values. In the Christian version of the religion of humanity, religious truth is historicized. I always notice in Catholic progressive circles, the Holy Spirit has commanded that we change sexual morality, that we accommodate ourselves to the zeitgeist, that we kneel before the world, that we get with it. The Holy Ghost is a secular and religious progressive and a historicist. You know, it's all silly, but that's the way people talk. Professor Mitchell mentioned the permanent things, a great term of T.S. Eliot, that was sort of popularized in United States cultural discussion by the conservative writer Russell Kirk. But I would say the progressivism and the religion of humanity are defined by a denial of permanent or enduring things. The world is, the arc of history, to use a phrase we often hear today, is moving. And by the way, in politics, we have so much vacuous political rhetoric that's centered around this utterly stupid idea that change is a good thing. Change is sometimes a good thing. It's certainly a law of social nature, but we all know that change can be deleterious. It can be destructive of goods. It can undermine our nature. It can undermine common life. Certainly the change posited by the ideological and totalitarian revolutions of the 20th century were very destructive things indeed. So this idea, this vacuous idea that unrelenting change, a kind of frontal assault on the permanent things, is a mark of vitality and freedom and liberation, is it's nothing but bluster, ideological bluster. One other thing, secular humanitarians and progressive Christians are increasingly ignorant of, and silent about the sempiternal drama of good and evil in the individual soul. Mercy is always on their lips, but not genuine forgiveness. Roger Scruton, the great British philosopher, political philosopher, man of letters, in his last interview with a Hungarian cultural journal, he said, "Why is forgiveness so absent among our cultural and political progressives. Yeah, they want mercy because mercy means relativism in their view. Nothing is forbidden. There are no intrinsic limits. On the other hand, if you are not in accord with this liberationist or progressive, on let's say the new gender ideology, you are never to be forgiven, right? And so in the in the world of secular humanitarianism and its religious humanitarian cousins, we hardly ever hear demands for conversion. Words like repentance and everything it entails, the changing of the soul, what the Greek philosophers and poets called metanoia. It's not part of their working vocabulary because it's not part of their view of the world. In contrast, I think, humanitarians in both their secular and religious variants take their bearings not from T.S. Eliot's permanent things. No, the soul is no longer called to be informed by the cardinal virtues of courage, temperance, justice, and prudence. Nor does it need to be elevated by the theological virtues of which St. Paul spoke, faith, hope, and love. In place of the virtues so central to human flourishing and salvation, one finds, and I use this word quite deliberately, one finds multiple examples of Christians inebriated by ideology. That's what ideology does. It's a kind of drunkenness. It inebriates the soul and the mind and heart. It gets in the way of clear thinking. It subverts a correct or fundamentally truthful understanding of human destiny and human purposes under God. It was Max Scheler, the great 20th century German philosopher and phenomenologist, who during his long Catholic phase reminded us, I love this quote, "Repentance, not utopia, is the greatest revolutionary force in the world." But it seems to me many churchmen, many social justice activists, many humanitarian and religious progressives are much more interested in creating utopia. Remember, the etymology of utopia is from the Greek utopos, nowhere, no place, right? A lot of the classic utopias were, accounts of utopias that really cities in speech that really couldn't exist in reality. Well, these people are all too committed to making these utopian projects real. So in all these fronts, our progressives, liberationists, and humanitarians run the grave risk of substituting counterfeit goods for real ones. As Winston Churchill once said, all wisdom is not new wisdom. And that really relates to the sort of cult of the new, of the tyranny of the present moment, the disdain for old wisdom, which is seen to be exploitative and tied to sexism and classism and ableism and all these terrible ideological phrases that have deformed contemporary vocabulary. So one lesson, I think, is we should be very hesitant indeed to dismiss the tried and true wisdom of the past, wisdom confirmed by revelation, by right reason, and by human experience. Now, I happen to be a Roman Catholic, and for a long time, the political philosopher Leo Strauss, in a speech at the University of Detroit in 1964, and this was just when, you might say, to quote Walter Lippmann, the acids of modernity were affecting the Catholic Church. But early in 1964, he said, there's one great spiritual, political, religious institution in the modern world that self-consciously rejects the modern project of humanitarianism, progressivism, historicism, indulgence toward left-wing tyranny. He said it was the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, there was a Pope, Pio IX, Pius IX, and he'd kind of been burned by Italian Revolution. He started off as a reformer. He issued a syllabus of errors in 1864. He wasn't a humanitarian. And the last of the 80 errors was that the Holy Roman Pontiff should make his peace with progress, science, and modern civilization. You know, so here was a pope who thought these were kind of all, he was too reactionary, but he saw all of these things as vehicles for undermining and transforming and perhaps negating Christian truth. Now, there are plenty of churchmen today and serious Christian intellectuals, students of contemporary culture and politics and political philosophy who are aware of these dangers. Let me give you one. Cardinal Gerard Müller, who is a German cardinal, he was the former head of the Congress for the Defense of the Congregation for the Defense of the Faith, the CDF, which is sort of the doctrinal watchdog of the Vatican. He was dumped by Pope Francis. He had been appointed by Pope Benedict. But he recently said in an interview with the Catholic World Report that there is growing confusion in the church. He says the loudest voices in contemporary Christian circles are ideologists for whom, as Cardinal Müller went on to say, quote, global warming is more important than the awareness that God is the source of the goal of man and of the whole creation, unquote. Are counterfeit Christians, Müller adds, humanitarians holding on to a small but systematically transformed residue of the historic faith, appear to believe that, quote, modern man can understand Jesus only as a moral preacher, a teacher of inclusion, an advocate of environmental protection, not on sexual morality, of course. All right. So these opening remarks are intended to give you a sense not only of the character and nature of the secular religion that I, following Comte, call the religion of humanity, but also to suggest that an increasing number among churchmen and faithful do not understand that the religion of humanity is not our religion. They do not understand how destructive it is of Christian truth and self-understanding, and they do not understand how destructive it is of decent morals and decent politics. I think what we see in both, certainly in the university world, outside of wonderful, sane enclaves like Patrick Henry College, I speak at a lot of small, healthy, vibrant, educational enclaves, and God bless them all. But outside of these circles, what one sees is the manifestations of the religion of a post-political and post-Christian world. And I would say the defining traits of this religion is marked by the coming together of a facile relativism. Who am I to judge? Who's to say what's right and wrong? With what I'm going to call a toxic and coercive moralism. It's all of a piece. Anyone who suggests that human dignity depends on liberty under law, that there is no liberty without limits, or what Solzhenitsyn called repentance and self-limitation. Again, not imposed, arbitrarily or despotically by political authority, but through the self-limitation of free men and women. Well, they're written off as reactionaries, to be silenced. There's no place for them in the emerging new order. So I do think, a lot of people will say, well, we used to say the problem was relativism, but now everyone's so moralistic. It's all of a piece. Toxic relativism and toxic moralism are dual and complementary and interpenetrating expressions of the same reigning philosophy. So this witch's brew of relativism and moralism cannot be allowed to capture the hearts and souls of the churches and churchmen. And I think to respond to it, we need something very different than passivity. We need what Solzhenitsyn once called the courage to see. And I've really come to realize how rare the courage to see is. How many people, for reasons of self-interest, ambition, fear, self-seeking, running for the hills, often obfuscate what's right before them. It takes a certain courage to see, you might say, all the consequences of the reigning ideologies that are in the process of transforming our republic, our churches, and the very self-understanding of Christians. And I think there's a lot of intellectual reasons for this, the growth of this ersatz secular religion, but it's tied, I think, to dangerous modern efforts to separate reason from faith, facts from values, and a strange openness in religious circles to ideological representations of humanity that don't have much or anything to say about sacred limits or restraints. I think I have a few more minutes, so I am going to end with a brief excursus, brief presentation on Pope Benedict XVI, who was Roman Catholic pontiff from 2005 to 2013. He's still alive, frail, but with a fine mind. For the first time in the history of the Roman Church, we have something called the Pope Emeritus. And the two popes, they say they like each other, but I think they represent two different visions of Christianity and its public engagement. But anyway, Pope Benedict is one of the great Catholic theologians of the last millennium, and he's the author of a truly magisterial trilogy called Jesus of Nazareth. The first chapter of Volume 1 of Jesus of Nazareth includes a searching and penetrating critique of humanitarianism through the form of an exegesis and commentary on a very luminous treatment of the temptations of Jesus, the temptation stories in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which recollect, I think, what we can only call an inner struggle in the human person of Jesus. Matthew 4:1 refers to Jesus being tempted by the devil. So what does this have to do with the danger of conflating Christian truth and revelation and right reason with the religion of humanity? Well, in the biblical accounts, according to Benedict, and I think he's right, Jesus must struggle to remain faithful to his task and not be misled by the provocations and false promises of the evil one. You all know who the evil one is. You know, the Lord's Prayer probably should end, "Deliver us from the evil one." That's certainly what the early church meant. The devil promises Christ's political power and the amelioration of all the social problems that plague humanity. Will Christ set God aside as an illusion that gets in the way of fighting for social justice or truly pressing problems? Or will he remain faithful to the mission that his Father has entrusted to him? The devil, the evil one, imagines a world that human beings construct by our own lights, as Benedict says, without aid from the grace and goodness of the eternal God. In this understanding, everything is to be reduced to the political and material, to an essentially ideological understanding of human life. And what's amazing, and Benedict emphasizes this in no uncertain terms, Christ emphatically rejects that reading of his mission and our subsequent missions. Christianity, then, can never be understood as a merely humanitarian project without betraying faith in the promises of God or a true understanding of Christ's mission on earth. The Pope Emeritus shows what is at stake in the devil's admonition, Luke 4:30, to command this stone to become bread. And of course, what an affront hunger is, and how pressing this problem must appear to the one who has a truly messianic vocation. Must not it, same question Dostoevsky raises in the Tale of the Grand Inquisitor, must not it, the provision of bread, come before all else, end world hunger? Then we can worry about virtue, as Dostoevsky famously wrote. Jesus rejects this path. And as Benedict comments, this path, the devil's path, is exactly what Marxism would so clamorously demand in the 19th and 20th century. Before asking human beings of virtue and salvation, we have to solve the social problem, including hunger. Then we can worry about our souls, if we ever get around to that. Give the people bread and then worry about virtue and freedom, as the great Dostoevsky famously exclaimed. But Benedict, very wisely in his commentary on the temptation narratives, highlights a great paradox. A materialist ideology such as Marxism led to hunger and starvation on a truly massive scale. Most people in communist regimes, 120 million people died in the 20th century, the majority of deaths were not in the camps, although tens of millions of people died in the camps too. They were from hunger, brought about by forced collectivization. And Benedict points out that a materialist ideology such as communism led to hunger and starvation on a truly massive scale in Soviet Russia and Ukraine, Maoist China, Ethiopia, and North Korea. All those rock and rollers in the 80s, they're having those Ethiopia concerts, World Aid, and all that. None of them seem to know that Mengistu and the Ethiopian communists, this wasn't bad weather. This was the typical pattern of communist despotism, starving the peasants to death by confiscating their land. So these weren't the results of bad weather. They were built into the very ideological structure, the DNA of Marxist-Leninism. Why, Benedict asks? Because communism ignored the needs of the soul, pushing to the side the inherent dignity of the human person, and the paradoxical result was it led to the ruin and destruction even of material goods themselves. So the Marxist project is one emblematic, one illustrative example of the ideological project more broadly, but also of the devil's project, the humanitarian project to establish a politics or post-politics where the human soul and the demands of virtue had no place whatsoever. But that meant the extirpation of human liberty and a paradoxical economic impoverishment of human beings. Why? As Pope Benedict says, humanitarianism, applied humanitarianism in the form of ideological politics, always sacrifices real human beings to what Pope Benedict called, with an Old Testament image, the Moloch of the future. So remember, the devil shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. He can have power over heaven and earth. He can solve the social problem. He can be the Bono of the age. You know, Bono, remember, he was going all around the world fighting world hunger and leading the crusade and meeting popes and meeting Bill Clinton and meeting George Bush. And how he was acclaimed. I'm sure Bono's a very nice man, but he sort of was humanitarian chief for a few years. But Jesus didn't follow that path. The Son of Man did not offer us a religion of humanity or political liberation or emancipation in this world from the terrible challenges of sin and death. His was a call to repentance and not a project to promote political liberation. And I'll end on this note. Pope Benedict is very enamored of Vladimir Soloviev, the Russian philosopher, who in his final book, War, Progress, and the End of History, wrote a prophetic and prescient tale of the Antichrist, where the Antichrist comes to the forefront as a humanitarian, trying to solve social problems. He's a pacifist, he's a vegetarian, he's an ecologist, he's everything but a faithful adherent to the religion of Christ. And he writes a booklet, becomes an international bestseller, on creating a planned and organized world. So Soloviev, in the introduction to War, Progress, and the End of History, which concludes with the tale of the Antichrist, says the Antichrist will come in the form, not of some horrific evil that we are repulsed by, but instead, the Antichrist will represent the falsification of the good. And I think that's exactly what Pope Benedict was warning about. In other words, humanitarianism has such an allure for secularists and religious people alike because under the guise of the good, it promotes the systematic and demonic falsification of the good. All right, I hope that I tried to say a few provocative things along the way and to give you some illustrations that might make things a little less abstract, but I welcome all comments and questions.
Thank you, Professor Mahoney. We will now have some time for questions. So if you have any, raise your hand. I will walk the mic to you so that your voice can be heard by those who are joining us online. And Marina is also going to be taking questions from those who are joining us via Zoom. Any questions?
Don't be shy. And by the way, sometimes the best questions are if a point needs to be clarified or you're not quite sure. My students always come up to me after class and ask those questions. I'm like, don't ask me after class, ask publicly, because other people have the same question, so don't be shy.
Good morning. Dr. Mitchell introduced you as an expert on totalitarianism, and I was wondering to what degree do you see signs of classic totalitarianism in our own culture?
You have to be very careful because, you know, we're here in, is it Purcell? Okay. You know, people are watching this on the internet. Obviously, if this were Lenin and Stalin's Russia, we wouldn't be doing this. If it were the Chinese Cultural Revolution, we would already be laboring on the pig farm. I'm very afraid of getting sent to a pig farm. On the other hand, I think that response is too facile because I do think there is more than a whiff of totalitarianism in the air. I think structurally, woke ideology perfectly shares the totalitarian impulses of the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century. It's based on an ideological Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism was, you know, God's here, the devil's here, evil is wholly located in one place. Nazism and communism were, of course, atheistic and fanatical forms of secular religion, but they had in common a denial of original sin, of the sempiternal drama of good and evil in human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn says in a very famous passage in the Gulag Archipelago, you can limit evil in your own soul. We can limit through institutional arrangements and through a common commitment to decency and civility its hold on human communities. But we can never expunge evil from the world. And again, to go back to one of Pope Benedict's paradoxes, when we try to do that, we amplify evil because the temptation carried out fully and extensively by the ideological despotisms of the 20th century were to imprison, coerce, punish, and often kill those who were seen to be the embodiments of evil in our time. I think certainly the woke are fully, progressives have always been committed to that view. I'm not talking about simply progressivism as an American civic movement that sort of downplayed the wisdom of the founders at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. I'm talking about that progressive mentality, what Solzhenitsyn is called the progressive progressive doctrine that said, these are the evildoers. It's the bourgeoisie, it's the clergy, it's the independent intellectuals, it's the Christians. Get rid of them, and our new liberationist utopia will flourish. We're there. Doctrinally, we're there. And I would say quite a few institutions in civil society are deeply imbued with that Manichaean and totalist ideology. I think the colleges and universities are, with a few notable exceptions. My college, the Student Government Association, wants everyone to take an anti-racist pledge according to the principles of Ibn Kendi. We're a Roman Catholic college. What Ibn Kendi stands for, that whiteness is intrinsically evil, that blacks are permanent victims, that you're a racist if you're passive by not joining in his fanatical anti-racism, et cetera, and the students are committing themselves to fight microaggressions in the classroom. I'll tell you what microaggressions are. Microaggression is Lincoln saying the Declaration of Independence provides a ground for opposition to slavery, and saying with Frederick Douglass that the Constitution is a glorious freedom document which in principle did not support slavery. Lincoln and Douglass are clearly guilty of perpetuating microaggressions for these totalitarians. So we're not finished. The Republic's not finished. We can still speak up. But there are ominous, ominous signs. And I don't want to make this too political in a narrow partisan sense, but we have a new administration which is introducing wokeness in a very systematic way into the armed forces. The armed forces should be too busy doing what armed forces do, protecting the country, to be promoting ideological projects. And we also have the official endorsement by every level of the state bureaucracy of this truly this metaphysical madness, as Edmund Burke said, called gender theory. A man at will. You know that that actress Ellen Page, who was in Juno, that kind of pro-life movie? And on December 11th, she announced on Facebook she was now Elliot. Nothing else had happened. And if you go to Wikipedia, she's a he all her life who was cruelly assigned the wrong gender at birth by evil doctors. This is insane. This is as insane as the Salem witch trials. Critical race theory is metaphysical madness, and it will tear us apart. It will lead to racism and racial conflict. So I'm very worried. But is America a totalitarian country today? No. But Rod Dreher, among others, has used the term soft totalitarianism. I would say that the emerging soft totalitarianism and the accompanying ideological lies are not so soft anymore. They risk hardening into a coercive, despotic regime. It's not here, but more than the rudiments are here. So, yeah, that's my answer. We've got a lot to worry about.
So we have a number of questions that came in online.
Okay.
I'll select one. This is an anonymous attendee who has a good question. They want to know, does a philosophical and/or theological engagement with the ersatz religion of our time, that is, with secular identity politics, not require an intellectual sympathy with the historical roots and causes of the liberation movements of race, gender, class, and orientation?
I did not hear the second part. Does it not require sympathy?
I think they're asking, what should we do to deal with this question in a manner that recognizes where these humanitarian instincts come from and the injustices that are there and have been there at times?
You know, I'm tempted to say yes, but I'm ultimately going to say no. Look, I do not believe that a movement like Marxism is fundamentally motivated by care for the least advantaged or love of neighbor in a Christian sense. I think Marxism is a pretty hate-filled ideology and doctrine motivated by contempt for the real. Marx and Engels had Engels a little more. Marx had no direct experience of poor people. The proletariat was an ideological abstraction for him. Now, have many people historically identified with socialist and communist movements out of a misplaced sense of sympathy or a concern for the poor? Yes. And that's where I think we have to be very careful to show that that is not what these movements are about. They're about something much more radical and much more destructive. But yes, critical race theory again. I don't think we have to go on and on about the evils of racism. I think there's a huge consensus in the religious communities and the political community abroad that racism is intolerable. But I think critical race theory is the #1 venue for codifying racism today. It is an example of racialized ideological Manichaeism that sets white about black. And so, I don't know. I don't think we have to waste a lot of time by saying, oh, these are all well-intentioned people responding to real problems. I don't think America suffers from systematic racism. I do think the problem of a black community faced with many social pathologies, 84% of children born out of wedlock, the collapse of two-parent family homes, all of that is terrible. And there's lots of things to be discussed there. But we've made great progress in this country. And I do not believe that the major destructive ideological movements of our time are particularly informed by goodwill. So.
In the lecture that was presented today, you seem to point out that we need a theology that resists antinomialism, and we need people who, out of their own free will, choose good and not to, abuse their liberty. My question is, to what extent can non-believers, non-Christians, who don't have, the Holy Ghost and the Church adjuring them to walk in a manner that's worthy of the Lord, to what extent can they succeed in suppressing their own base desires?
Well, that's a very fine question. Maybe it's easier for a Catholic to answer, since we have long been convinced that the natural virtues, the cardinal virtues, are natural to human beings. They're part of the natural law available to right reason and human experience. And just like I think one doesn't need any special knowledge from Revelation to recognize the abomination that is abortion on demand. It's always the pro-choice camp who thinks that the pro-life argument is rooted exclusively in confessional or religious commitments. But yes, I think certainly there are experiential, phenomenological arguments for natural law, practical reason, moral good sense. But historically and practically, that has always been buttressed and deepened by Christian categories and self-understanding. I think it's a problem. But it's always a mistake, I think, to think that short of mass religious conversion, a restoration of common sense and moral decency is impossible. But I would say people who begin to understand the human soul in light of ends and purposes that belong to our freedom, that elevate our souls, are also going to be people much more likely to be open to Christian truth. But I also think it's important for Christians to affirm the natural virtues in their own sphere. But it's a real hard problem because we desperately need conversion to the faith, but also conversion to the permanent things more broadly, more civilizationally. And we need both. And their precise relationship, I think, is difficult to conjugate. But no, it's good and important question. But I'm not sure the solution to our cultural crisis is simply more missionary work, because an awful lot of Christians have been taken in by this humanitarianism. They don't get things despite their professions of faith.